Shorelines at Cattus Island County Park in Ocean County, New Jersey. My name is Susan M. Hart-Servideo. I'm with the Rutgers Cooperative Extension in Ocean County. I'm one of the horticulturists, and also with me tonight is Patty Dixon, our other horticulturist in the office. And we help bring you these programs and just, lots of fun answering questions from all over the place. And tonight with us, we do have I almost said Patty. We do have Nikki, uh, Nikki Vernacchio. Nope. Yeah, Vernacchio. Did I say it
Yep.
right? Okay.
Got
Sorry.
it.
Principal park naturalist at Cattus Island. And I'm going to pretty much just turn it right over to you, Nicole, or Nicole, and we'll go from there.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Susan and Patty, for having me this evening, and everyone else who joined in tonight. My name is Nicole Vernacchio. I do commonly go by Nikki. So we'll go with that for this evening because you're all my friends now. And yes, I am the park supervisor at Cattus Island County Park and the principal park naturalist. And I really wanted to just share with you today some exciting projects that are going to be happening around Cattus Island Park in the next several years. It's a fairly new, kind of some new things that are going on that we're going to start seeing more in the park. But if you are not familiar with the park or have never been there before or don't live around here, I think it's going to be something interesting to also share about how areas can help kind of protect their shorelines kind of for the future. So before I get more chatty and talkative into that, I do have a great presentation. So let me share my screen and we will go from there.
And yep, we do see your
Excellent. Okay. Okay, so again, this is kind of across from Cattus Island County Park. It's looking at the shoreline of Cattus Island Park proper. We are located off of Fisher Boulevard in Toms River, part of Ocean County. And we are about 530 acres, more so actually, but the park proper is composed of about 530 acres. And we have about 7 miles of marked walking and hiking trails and some biking paths as well. So Cattus Island County Park, if you take a look at it on our map, is actually a peninsula. So it's surrounded 3 sides by water, and it actually separates, let me see if I can get my mouse here. It actually separates Silver Bay from Barnegat Bay at our point of land right up here. Now, many people wonder, well, why in the world is it called an island if it's technically a peninsula? Which is a great question. So we do have several different types of habitats at Cattus Island Park, which kind of makes it nice because you can take a walk here and visit through an upland forest, maritime type forest, freshwater swamps, and marshland. So our salt marsh really is our dominant habitat at Cattus. It's over 70% of the park itself is comprised of the salt marsh habitat. And what happens with the salt marsh is it's tidal. So it's going to receive high and low tides. And the water that's surrounding Cattus Island in Silver and in Barnegat Bay is brackish water. So it's a mixture of salt water and fresh water. It's not quite as salty as the ocean, but you would still taste some saltiness to it. So the plants and animals that live around the salt marsh really have to be adapted to getting wet at some point when dry, and also to have salt water around them. So when we do have tidal flooding, that salt marsh can flood over quite well, especially in the last few years. And mix a high tide with a full moon and a nor'easter is generally a recipe for making Cattus Island proper. That's the area of land in the center of the park, which when all this salt marsh is covered over by water, leaves an island in the center. So that's how we get the name Cattus Island. Many visitors do come and they wonder, I didn't cross a bridge to get here. I don't quite understand what the island part is. But it's days like those flooded days that make it an actual island itself. The Cattus part actually comes from the last owners of the property. John Cattus and his family lived at the park in the late 1800s to the mid 1900s. So Cattus Island is also home to the Cooper Environmental Center. The Cooper Environmental Center was opened in 1980, and it was dedicated to providing natural science education, particularly about habitats, flora, and fauna based on the Ocean County animals and plants and habitats that can be found around here. So inside the exhibit room, we have many hands-on activities, taxidermied animals, and we also have live reptiles with our snakes and turtles that visitors can come and visit and view, all native species to the area. And we also do see a lot of school groups and school classes that come to the Nature Center for environmental education. And also we go out to those groups as well. Now in 2012, we did have Superstorm Sandy. The Nature Center was affected by the storm, where we received about 7 inches of water, which came up to about this door line here. The water came up to, which was just enough to get everything all wet and nasty inside. So we did have a renovation and reopened back in 2017. Okay, so talking a little bit about Superstorm Sandy, a little bit, maybe some coastal flooding. You may or may not be familiar with some effects of coastal flooding, maybe day to day if you do live locally. Maybe you noticed, when we start getting warnings for coastal storms, there's certain roads that maybe you have to avoid. Maybe you're affected by some of the flooding often because you might need to move your cars, or it might affect your work or your recreation. So we really noticed, particularly in the last 20 to 25 years, that there's been some things that have been happening at Cattus Island that started happening a lot more often. And we started to take a look at some of the effects that we've been noticing around the park itself. One of the things that are kind of interesting is that we see a big increase on our trails that are now routinely getting flooded. Now, I did mention about, Cattus Island becoming an island when that marsh floods over. And that used to happen really once in a blue moon. Back, I would say before 1990, that flooding turning into an island happened maybe every couple of years. Well, now this is happening. This is our main trail here. This is happening pretty much once every season, to the point where now I have to post closed trail signs. And this is something that we've really kind of noticed, because there's nothing worse than us having to say you can't go walk in the park. But that's what's starting to happen because we are seeing such an increase in flooding in our area. Because of that flooding, remember I mentioned that salty or brackish water that's coming in, that kind of affects the trees that are growing around those areas because they do like fresh water. So we're noticing stands of dead trees starting to die off along those edges of the salt marsh. And you're going to hear me mention an area called Yellowbank and also an area called Pages Point. And they've been seeing erosion for quite a long time now, but specifically in the last 20 to 25 years, we've really seen an increase in erosion in these spots and many spots along Cattus Island Park itself. And then we had a funny little thing happen. We've been seeing a beach all of a sudden starting to grow and grow and grow. And now we have a new beach where many boats tend to come and gather. And this is something that hadn't been there in the past about 20 years. So we've just kind of noticed these changes that were going on up and around the park. So we do have a series of fun maps, I like to call them, just to kind of show you some of the changes that have been happening around Cattus Island Park. Now, I mentioned the Cattus family as being the last owners of the property. There's been many owners on the property before the Cattuses, and the first owner that actually lived on the park was Timothy Page. So we have Page's Point, this point of land up here, that we've named after Mr. Page and his family. Mr. Page lived here actually during the Revolutionary War, which is pretty neat. So really, for the most of my presentation today, you're going to hear me talk a lot, make reference to Page's Point, and you're also going to hear me talk about Yellowbank. So Yellowbank is an area on the western part of Cattus Island Park. This is where our Parks Administrative Office area is. Now, taking a look on the map, this looks all connected as it is, but it's really hard to drive physically from Cattus Island Park to our Parks Administration area without going back onto the main road of Fisher Boulevard and coming down Yellowbank Road, aptly named. So this area here is a shoreline that was characteristically very yellow-orange in color. There's a high amount of iron in the soil that makes it that yellow color. So in the series of maps that I have coming up, I just want you to take a quick look at the Yellowbank area here for any types of changes, and also on Page's Point. So this is 1930. This is the earliest map that I have. And if we jump ahead about 50 years into 1977, take a look at Page's Point. There we go. We're getting a little rounder. We're not as pointy as we were back in the 1930s. And, Yellowbank has a little point up here, nothing too drastic going on. You can see the houses that are being built along the edge area there. Jump ahead in about another 20 years, and this is 1995. Now there is a little bit more technology going on where we can see some of the sand that's kind of underneath the water at Yellowbank and how shallow the area is. We see Page's Point again is starting to lose some of its pointiness. And I want you to also look over here on this cove. This cove is called Mosquito Cove, aptly named. Actually, if I go back, Silver Bay actually used to be called Mosquito Bay back before 1950. Okay, so if I jump ahead to 2007, again, we've got a lot of sand that's building up more underneath the water. It's actually washing way off of Yellowbank proper. We're starting to build our little beach here in Mosquito Cove. And again, we're starting to get, even more or less of a point near Page's Point. 2012, this is the year of Superstorm Sandy. I do not know if this map was before or after. You could see Page's Point again, getting smaller, less or more sand that's sort of built up underneath Silver or Yellowbank, and we're seeing more of a beach accruing there. So this is about 10 years ago. 2015, again, Page's Point's getting smaller, Yellowbank's receding, and we're getting a lot more sand in the cove. Okay, so we took a look at that data. We said, all right, well, let's map our shoreline from 2016, and let's map the shoreline in 2001. So that's a 15-year span. Are we imagining things? Are we really losing shoreline, or are we just, thinking other things are going on? Well, when you kind of overlay that data, you can kind of see the changes. You can really see just in a 15-year span, the area of Page's Point. You can see definitely where it's been receding, and definitely over here as well on Yellowbank. There's some patches up and around the park itself, but these are the big kind of areas that are in question. So what we did find is that Yellowbank has lost about 35 feet and on average in the past 15 years. So that's an average of 2.3 feet a year. And Page's Point has lost about 1.7 feet per year for an average of about 25 feet over the last 15 years. So we're not imagining it, okay? We really kind of figured out, all right, the shoreline of Cattus Island is disappearing. And they calculated that about in 80 years, 300 feet of shoreline has been lost from the park itself. So, all right. With this data, they're thinking, well, what does 300 feet mean? What does that really look like? There's staff members that have been there a long time who can say, okay, you know, I remember this certain tree used to be, you know, far out into the forest, is now right on the water line. We've had signs that we've had to actually remove because they're now in the middle of the water, or trails that continually need to be moved back into the forest. So we took an overlay of that 1930 map, which is in the blue area. The blue area actually shows recession of the land. And on top of that, we have a 2015 map on top of it. And it really kind of shows how much change has gone on almost 100 years ago, and how much change has been going on along the shorelines and along the area. And, you know, is there something that can be done to maybe not even stop, but to kind of help or lessen some of the loss that might be happening? So why is this occurring? Which is a great question. And I can't say I know all the answers to it. But we have seen lots of dramatic changes in the environment, particularly in the last 20 to 25 years globally. We've seen dramatic changes in sea level rise, increase in storms. You know, around Cattus itself, we're seeing increased storming, flooding. We see a lot of boat activity. And we also thought of something that isn't quite so obvious, and it's a fun word. And maybe you'll think of this word next time you're playing Wordle, because I think it would be a good one. But it's something called fetch. It's a great word, fetch, and fetch length. So we took a look at the fetch, and we figured out that this might have, you know, a strong effect of what's going on around the shoreline, around the park. So what is a fetch? So it's an area of an ocean or lake surface over which the wind blows in essentially a constant direction. So wind produces waves. There's lots of things that can produce waves, like vibrations, earthquakes, explosions, but wind is your primary generator or producer of a wave. And a wave is energy that's moving. And a fetch length is actually the horizontal distance from which a wave generating winds blow. So you can think of it, it's a distance that a wave actually travels. So if we take a look at a quick old map of Cattus Island Park area, we realize that when the winds blow from the northeast, essentially they are traveling about 4.5 miles from that initial blow on Barnegat Bay. That wave is going to travel down 4.5 miles long and is going to hit nothing else until it hits Pages Point or Yellowbank. So that's a lot of energy that wave is traveling and going and then impacting those areas of land. Now, around Cattus Island Park, around the Silver Bay side, here we go here, there's a lot of development here. In fact, Cattus Island Park, the Parks Administrative Office area, and there's Natural Lands Trust property that's called Tilton Point. All this is a fairly large part of natural preserved land in this northern section of Barnegat Bay. So we realized that, you know, Cattus Island is really important. It has a lot of value in many different ways. Like I mentioned, the park, the administrative property, Tilton Point is one of the largest natural areas in Barnegat Bay in the northern section. It has a huge physical, financial, and recreational value to the community surrounding it. So it's estimated that about $35 million Cattus Island actually protects those homes and businesses in the Silver Bay area from other storm waves and the effects of the erosion. It has a large natural resource value, which we're going to go into a little bit more, but lots of resources for game fish and other submerged aquatic vegetation and shellfish. There's a strong cultural history. That Yellowbank area was actually a site of a Lenni Lenape encampment. There's an archaeological dig done on that site back in the 1940s. And Lenni Lenape used to actually come to Yellowbank as a summer home. They'd come there and harvest the shellfish and stuff out of the bay. And then this is a great educational opportunity. The Cooper Environmental Center sees, hundreds of thousands of visitors each year in groups, and it'd be a great way to kind of educate people on our shoreline and some of the changes that have been happening, and what we're kind of doing to try to hold fast onto those. So it would also be the largest living shoreline in the northern part of Barnegat Bay. And it would also provide valuable research opportunities. So things that living shoreline projects that would be enacted at Cattus would be monitored and studied by various groups looking to get research on living shorelines around the area. Okay, so a living shoreline. It sounds like it could be fairly simple when you hear the words living shoreline. So its technical definition is it's connecting the land and the water to stabilize the shoreline. Okay, it's reducing erosion, and it's protecting. Let me shrink my view here. And it provides ecosystem services like valuable habitat that enhances coastal resilience. Okay, sounds good. But what does this actually mean? So here's some examples of some living shorelines. Okay. So living shorelines encompass a wide range of different stabilization techniques. Generally, it's made with living materials, such as plants, such as salt marsh grasses, that are also mixed with hardened type structures like oyster reefs or rocks or large pieces of wood. So it's typically used along estuaries and bays and tributaries and other protected shorelines. But living shorelines generally aren't used on open beaches or the ocean. And I'll kind of explain that a little bit further. And as I mentioned, it's a footprint made mostly of native materials that help to stabilize the shoreline. So I love this graphic because it's kind of an overview of some of the shoreline techniques that can be used. And we're going to start a little backwards, and we're going to go all the way here to the right on the bulkhead. So around Silver Bay area, around Cattus Island, across the way, there's many homes that are on that side. And this is predominantly what's used across the way is the bulkhead. It's a hardened structure. It works really well. There's a lot of waves and a lot of energy. And it does its job by making itself a little wall to help protect the land behind it. Okay, so we have bulkheads. We have something called revetments that also protect the shoreline. Generally a hardened structure, kind of, absorbs some of that wave impact, but that's about it. Breakwaters. Breakwaters are designed to kind of have a barrier of rock in front of the shoreline with a little bit of gaps in between, as well as sills and edging. These are all used to kind of help reduce the energy of the waves, the attenuating energy. So it's that energy that those waves are putting out. It will kind of break up those waves, and then the native vegetation actually helps to rebuild sand and produce other vegetation behind it. It kind of helps to establish the land back behind that area. So living shorelines support resilient communities. If we take a look on the right again, if we take a look at bulkheads, they really prevent natural marsh migration and growth. Really, you just have a hard stone, hard wall structure that's there that can easily be damaged by storms. In 2000 or 2100, about 33% of the shorelines in the U.S. will be hardened And this is going to decrease fisheries habitat and biodiversity if we keep continuing on the lines that we're going on. But living shorelines are more resilient. They're more resilient against storms. So I was really happy to hear this because, being at Cattus Island, being at the Nature Center, I've been through Superstorm Sandy. When I do have a tidal event, I'm ready to go to the park. I'm ready to post my signs. I'm ready to determine, do I need to close the park? Do I need to keep it open? So storms are really a big, important factor, actually, in my occupation. And to know that, a project like a living shoreline, one of the first things I'm thinking is, what if we put this living shoreline in and the first, high tide storm that comes in is going to knock it all out. But little did I know that living shorelines are really designed to withstand storms like that and the coastal flooding. And they actually bounce right back from it, as opposed to some of our more hardened structures like bulkheads that it could be destroyed by. So I was sort of comforted by that a living shoreline kind of works with those storms and not against it. I mentioned before that a lot of natural materials are used with a living shoreline, like oyster reefs. Can be used to act as buffers to protect the shoreline, wood structures, rock type structures. Living shorelines improve water quality and increase fish habitat and biodiversity. They'll actually find homes within the living shoreline to propagate and to live in. And behind the living shoreline, you have the salt marshes. And I had mentioned that Cattus Island, 70% of the property is made up of those salt marshes that have been disappearing due to erosion. So the marshes will actually help trap the sediments in the tidal waters and allow them to grow. So with a living shoreline, you're actually growing productive land behind it. So I find it interesting that 1 square mile of salt marsh stores the carbon equivalent of 76,000 gallons of gas annually. So really, I always learned that the salt marsh is a pretty important place, but to know just how much they do for our environment, it's really up there and beyond comparing to an environment like, say, the rainforest. Many people do take a look at a salt marsh, especially if you're walking around one, and the first thing you think is, ooh, this is a stinky, smelly, dirty old swamp. The smell is generally the smell of rotten eggs, and that's actually the salt marsh working, and it's doing its job. Every year, the green grasses of the salt marsh will die off, and then in the spring, new sprouts of salt marsh grass will come back again. But those dying, decaying grasses are being eaten up by tiny bacteria, and that bacteria will actually secrete that sulfur or rotten egg kind of smell. That little bacteria becomes the source of a food web. Really, the sun shines down on those grasses are broken down by bacteria, and bacteria are eaten by tiny crabs and shrimp and baby fish. So the salt marsh is the basis of our local food chain and food web. Also is a nursery for many of our local fish. So if you're walking around a salt marsh, you'll see fish and crabs that are swimming in there, and they're all kind of on the small side because it really is a nursery. They will be sheltered within the marsh. Those creatures will grow and feed, and then they'll venture out into the bigger parts of the bay and maybe even into the ocean. So it's a great source of habitat for many creatures in the Barnegat Bay estuary. It protects the land behind it. It acts as a buffer. So when those waves come directly into the marsh, it has all that marsh area to kind of tone itself down and release that energy before it directly impacts the land behind it. And then the salt marsh also acts like a filter. It really does help to clean out pollutants that are in the water, as well as trap some of the bigger materials. Actually, with the grasses, it will help to kind of filter it out. So building up marsh behind a living shoreline is really a positive thing for the environment that's around it. So what are some of our benefits of a living shoreline? We talked about it protecting the shoreline from erosion. It provides a habitat for fish and other living creatures. It improves water quality and stores nutrients. It increases the land stability over time, attracts natural wildlife, and it can outperform those hardline shoreline structures in a storm. So these are some of the benefits that really outweigh what we used to do in the past. And there are really no real disadvantages to putting in a living shoreline, except for the physical settings. So I'd mentioned that they're really not found on open beaches and on the ocean. And that has to do with the wave energy. So to have an appropriate area for a living shoreline, you need to have the right amount of wave energy. Not too much and not too little. You can have it very deep offshore. It has to be kind of shallow. And then the slope of the land behind it has to be very small. It can't drop off like a cliff. So those three factors actually affect whether a living shoreline can be put in a certain area or not. The second disadvantage is kind of the aesthetic issue. I know as master gardeners, you may, be sometimes you have gardens or people expect a garden to look a certain way, very manicured, very set, lines, where there's gardeners that are all, love sort of the chaotic garden where you have this and you have that, and, it's more of a natural meadow and not so manicured. And in our eyes, people tend to look at the straight line aesthetic. And we're so used to looking at a straight line like a bulkhead as being our natural barrier between the land and the water, here in Ocean County, it's hard to see past maybe some nice, jaggedy green vegetation and some rock along the shoreline. So I think that's something that, people just kind of need to kind of get used to and see, and kind of see through those benefits, on the right compared to the left. Okay, so real quick, do we have any quick questions before I go into our project itself?
We did have a question earlier regarding do you think some of the changes that had happened showing when you showed the maps do you think it's global? I mean, this is a larger question maybe, but global warming, or is it really causing because of the changing of that the wave action and things that you're seeing?
I think it's actually a combination of all those factors. Yeah, for sure. Because especially with global warming, we've been seeing globally the last, 20 to 30 years. You could take a look at the different data, and the changes that have been happening during that time are, quite substantial. And that kind of goes along the same lines of, when we're noticing those changes too. But there are other factors that are definitely involved along with it. So.
And the only other question was a little bit more personal regarding a certain area. So I will send that one to you directly after. And Ed is asking, were those man-made structures in the water with the holes in them? I guess you'll talk about the different.
Yeah, I'm going to talk about some of the different ones. Those are man-made, but made out of some type of natural material. They're called reef balls. So I guess it's designed to kind of, if a wave were to crash onto them, it would kind of slow the wave. But then the wave could still kind of perk through them, and, fish would have habitat, to live in them as well. So,
there is one more
do you want to, yes, go ahead.
There is one more that came in. It's how will wind farm projects affect coastlines in the bay? I don't know if that's
right. I don't have the great answer for that, right now, but I definitely could look into that. And if you could get their email, I can definitely address that one at another time if that works.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, cool. All right, so a little bit now, you kind of know the when and the where and the what of how we kind of got to the place we're at. And so I'm going to just kind of show you the how. a little bit. In 2018, County Parks, along with planning, applied for a water quality restoration grant through the New Jersey DEP and was awarded a $3 million grant. And that would go to Stevens Institute of Technology, and they would be in charge of data collection, conceptual design, and support services to the shoreline, to the living shoreline at Cattus Island County Park. So right now we've ended phase 1, where Stevens Institute of Technology has done the site assessment and data collection. And we're just about to start phase 2, which is getting into the conceptual design and kind of actually implementing or setting up the living shoreline. And then the next phase would actually be the monitoring plan. So I did mention how this would be a research project where they would look back and see what worked, what didn't work, what can be changed, how could it be changed, how did it affect that area for future living shorelines. So we're sort of kind of just in the beginning stages of kind of getting things more into motion. So there's several stakeholders and partners that are involved with this project, and I may not even have all of them on the list. But here's just a sample of many of them that have been in the last few years instrumental in this project and continue on this project. So these are great resources that have lots of different things in mind: fisheries, submerged aquatic vegetation, Nature Conservancy should be on there, the Osprey, NOAA. So this is a project that's not being taken lightly. It's absolutely a partnership from lots of great environmental and resources that are determining, the best decisions for how to kind of keep Cattus Island where it is and preserve it for the future. So as I mentioned, Stevens Institute of Technology we had gotten the grant to have them help develop a concept for the living shoreline. There's their coastal engineering research group that's led by Dr. John Miller, and Laura Kerr. And they used the New Jersey Living Shoreline Engineering Guidelines. They took and looked at preliminary data, just kind of like we did on those different maps, but a little bit more specific. They took actual field data all last year. They were out with their students out and around the park taking different types of tests and measurements. And they came up with a conceptual design of possibilities for a living shoreline. So they were out in February of 2021. There was a coastal storm that was predicted around Groundhog Day, and they came out with wave loggers, and they put wave loggers by Pages Point and over by Yellowbank, and they set up these wave loggers, and they were out there for about 3 or 4 days, actually recording the wave velocity, wave height, ice that might have accrued, which did accrue that weekend. So they were out there putting these out to record the wave data that came in from that storm. They were also out in July of that year, 2021, to record waves during the middle of July, when we do see a lot of boats, a lot of recreation out on the water, to kind of record any wave action that is being created by boat activity. They were out doing bathymetry, which actually reads the depth of the shoreline under the water. So as I mentioned before, a living shoreline, to be able to create one, the wave data and information is important, as well as the depth of the shoreline underneath the water. So they were out in wave runners and jet skis, and they were actually mapping the depth around the park. And then they took a look at wind. And with wind, Dr. Miller and his group took a look at Lakehurst Naval Air Station's data, and they were able to gather information back from 1945 up to January of this year. And they wanted to know what prevailing winds are happening out there at Pages Point in Yellowbank. What kind of winds blowing, how fast, how frequent, and really that's related to that cool word of fetch. So those are the predominantly three basic things that they were looking at, plus some other factors that were involved. So Dr. Miller and his team kind of broke the park property up into 6 sections and came up with conceptual designs for each of those sections. But for tonight, I'm really just going to concentrate on section 3, which is Pages Point, and section 1, which is Yellowbank, because they are the 2 primary areas that we're going to look at first. So here's some of the data on Pages Point. They confirm the erosion. It's losing 2 to 4 feet per year, which is fairly moderate. The waves aren't that high, 1.5 to 2.5 feet. Boat wakes are kind of low to moderate. There's ice, and other types of factors that they may mention. And the shore depth about 2 to 6 feet. And they took that winds data and, added to that 4.5 mile fetch from the northeast that we had kind of come up with on our own. But they also found during that wind data that Pages Point is also getting hit with a northwest fetch of 0.5 mile and also a western fetch of 1.5 miles. So not only does Pages Point get rocked or hammered on the northeast side, but it's getting a pretty good job on the west and northwest side as well. So taking into account all that information and all that data, he also went back onto some historical aerials, which is kind of a neat website to go on and look at if you've never done that before. It's a great place to find some data. He also noticed that back in 1996, Pages Point, and before that, had this really great hook that occurred, the shallow sandbar that occurred off the point. It was still there kind of in 1963 and it's really starting to wane in 2017. Now I can say we used to do boat tours, or I used to run boat tours around Pages Point in the 1990s. And I do remember having to really go around Pages Point because there was a sandbar that would always be out there. And he seems to think the erosion of the sandbar really has affected Yellowbank down below. And that could also be why in the last 20 to 25 years, we're seeing such a change in the area, as that hook is getting reduced and then affecting Yellowbank behind it. He thinks that that really kind of helped protect Yellowbank, and that loss of that sandbar kind of contributed to some of the erosion that's happening there. Here's Yellowbank, a great up-close photo of Yellowbank. There's probably about 20 feet of beach here to the water. And you can see that yellowish color of the iron in the soil. Back in the 1990s, you could walk past and you would actually see flecks of shell mounds. That's from the Lenni Lenape. They had shell mounds there, which was their pile of shells that they were discarding. But you could see that in the soil, but that's pretty much all washed into the bay at this point. These cliffs, as we call them, are also a great place for cavity nesting birds like kingfishers and swallows. Certain swallows like to nest there as well. So this is an area that there's a lot of significance in this area. So he did note, there's 1 to 4 feet of erosion happening on this beach here, low to moderate waves. And there's also some upland erosion as the rain rains down. It will erode a little bit vertically from this area here. But, we're concentrating a little bit more on this beach line that's here, to kind of stabilize that area. He took a look at the wind and the direction with the fetch, and that 4.5 foot northeast fetch coming in. If it doesn't hit Page's Point, it goes directly into Yellowbank, along with a north-northwest 1 mile fetch. So that's really contributing to the erosion that's occurring there. So Dr. John Miller and his team came up with a conceptual design to stabilize Page's Point. Now, the yellow that we see going around the point itself, the squiggly line of yellow, is the 1977 high tide line. So I found it interesting because I said, why would they pick a 1977 high tide line? And I believe that year they actually have a survey that was done of the high tide lines in Ocean County. And that's documented as to the exact location of where that high tide line is. So technically, right now, Cattus Island County Park has been losing real estate, let's call it. If you say, okay, where would we put a living shoreline in? Where does Cattus Island begin? Well, we've learned we've lost so many feet. And technically, the mean high tide water line is where the state or navigable waterways begin. So to arbitrarily pick a space wouldn't work. So going back to the 1977 high tide line is a documented high tide line. So that's kind of where that yellow line comes in, where they would establish, putting in a living shoreline area based on that line. So he came up with a design, something called a whale's tail, to kind of stabilize the corners, and then T's. And T's would be kind of put in between to help stabilize it. Now, the way the currents run and flow and the way the water moves in, as the waves would come through, it would dissipate, but it would also still enable the wave to come through into the marsh area, deposit sediments, and over time, which, that would probably be less than 12 to 18 months, we could start seeing accretion of sand and salt marsh starting to build up behind it. So these are some examples that Dr. Miller had given us of what some of these whales' tails and T's could look like around the shoreline. And it would just be a few of those structures around the point to kind of help just to stabilize it and, produce a little bit more marsh behind it to help keep it there. The Yellowbank area, they kind of suggested a couple of different types of structures that could be used, or different methods that could be used. And again, this would be, go into the research type of, section of the park, where we could try one structure in one part of Yellowbank, try another structure in another section, and then a third type of structure to see, what works best, what materials or what setup of the shoreline would be the best effective to stabilize and regenerate some of the shoreline back again. So he did note that all the sand from those aerial photographs that we saw that were underneath the water, and I mentioned that beach that was kind of down in Mosquito Cove that was starting to grow, that we hadn't had in years. All that sand is actually coming from Yellowbank area itself. So as the current comes through, that sand is washed either into our boat lagoon, which fills up our lagoon, or the sand is taken to Mosquito Cove and deposited down on that beach. So he had suggested putting in small groins on either side to kind of help stabilize that movement of sand from those areas. And he just recommended, 3 different types of kind of structures: a wave attenuating structure, which is kind of like those reef balls that we saw earlier, or you could use oyster castles, which I think that's the cutest name of a structure. There's a structure called wads, which are kind of trapezoid structures with a hole in them, and they would be placed in a certain way and a certain height along that 1977 high tide line. He recommended an adaptable sill, and sills use large stones, which are about 2 feet in diameter, and they're put at different heights that can be changed. So if they find that the sill wasn't working in a certain, way, they could actually move and change the sills to adapt to the needs of this certain area. And then he also recommended a traditional sill, which is a little bit more structured, can't be quite changed as easily, but it would be good to see how these 3 recommendations, would help that area there, and then lead to further shorelines, in the future. Here's some examples of what some of those sills, could look like. These are from other types of projects. You can see the sand, starting to accrue behind them a little bit. And the idea is that wave energy, those waves are going to come in, some will pass through, some will actually get slowed down before they continued on onto the shoreline. So other living shorelines, as I mentioned, Cattus Island's project would be the largest project in Barnegat Bay. There are other natural properties in Barnegat Bay that are looking into doing living shorelines. And I was a part of a workshop at a living shoreline on the Delaware River. And this is kind of interesting because it was on the Delaware River on a little tributary near Trenton, one of the Mercer County parks. And they were looking to preserve 500 feet of shoreline because of artifacts that were actually in the shoreline. And it was being eroded away, and they were losing several historical artifacts by the day. So they were looking into a living shoreline to sort of preserve that area, to preserve those artifacts in the soil for the future, which I thought was interesting. This is another living shoreline, John C. Bartlett Jr. County Park at Berkeley Island. This is a county park, an Ocean County, one of the Ocean County parks that's located in Bayville. And this park sustained a lot of damage during Superstorm Sandy and was our initial living shoreline project. And what they did, and I believe Stevens was involved. I do not know the complete details of this project, but Stevens Institute was involved as well. And they designed the sills that kind of helped to reassure the shoreline area here. And you can see they're kind of similar to what we saw in the other pictures previous to it. So you could go online and do some more research on living shorelines. I'm the first to admit I'm fairly new to living shorelines, to be honest. And I've learned so much just being at Cattus Island and learning about these great kind of opportunities that are happening around us. But these are global projects that are happening. You can Google living shorelines in Jamaica, in Taiwan. They're actually happening all over the globe as a good ecological solution to, as opposed to having a hardened shoreline. So you could check out some of those projects that are happening, in the Carolinas, Virginia, Maryland. These are all just, and also I think a learning curve as well. There's a lot of ongoing research that's going on with these projects all over the world. So I'd like to thank you so much for allowing me to share our up and coming project with you. I'll keep everyone posted as we move forward with the project. There's really nothing to see right now at the park. There's no structures that are going in. Our latest, kind of up to the date is we're trying to secure funding, I believe, to ensure, some of those projects are, put forward. And I think hiring a coastal engineer is one of the first priorities to actually, manage the project that would go along with it. So it's exciting to see, some of these new changes that kind of will help preserve, this precious park for the future and for other generations to share as well. So thank you for having me tonight.
Well, great job, Nikki. It was just so interesting, and it's something new for me as well. I mean, I know the concept behind it, but to actually see it in action and close to home to help preserve what land we have, because I think, now that we're so built up, we're really trying to keep what open space we have still here with us. So
Right.
there were a few questions. Go ahead, Patty. I'm going to let you start if that's okay. There's not tons, but there are a few in.
Okay, great.
Yep, it just bounced. So just give me. Oh, okay. So Gerald was asking about the trail in Cattus Island. That's the boardwalk trail.
Okay.
And he noticed that there's dying trees along the sides, and he was wondering if that was due to the saltwater intrusion that you were talking about.
Right. So there's two different things that are kind of going on. So the boardwalk trail that's near the nature center, that's the accessible trail, that used to be actually a Atlantic white cedar swamp. So when I first started back in 1991, I would do a nature walk through a freshwater swamp, and I would see cranberry and pitcher plants in Atlantic white cedar. Um, that has changed unbelievably, where it's evolving into more of a marshy type of an area. So um, the cedar there started to kind of die off as those saltwater, flooding was coming in. There are other stands of cedar around the park that actually began to die off back when they put the Point Pleasant Canal in to the north of us, about 100 and so years ago. Cattus was a much fresher area. So there's stands of cedar that are still standing from that saltwater change way back then. But the accessible boardwalk trail is really kind of a visible change that's happened in the last, well, now it's 30 years. So
We have Debbie. She asked if people can hike to Yellowbank.
you can. So you can hike there from the Cattus side, or you could go through the park's administrative side. So that property is at 1198 Bandon Road. It's a little funny because you're driving through a development and you think, I cannot be going the right way, but it ends up into a large private property that was once private. It's now all public walkable space, and it's on the bay, and it's really pretty. And that Yellowbank Trail is a really pretty trail too.
Really pretty. I was there. I guess I went early last summer, and I hadn't been over to that side of the park for ages, and it's magnificent. It's so beautiful.
Right, and it was once a private residence, so it looks like this, 1960s mid-century house. So you're like, what is going on here? But that's where all of our parks administration offices are. So that house is divided up into many different offices, and downstairs is a program room, but you can, park down the hill, and that's where our boat leaves for our boat tours. We have kayak trips in the summer. You can, park there for the program room, or just walk around the area, and it's a really pretty spot for taking a look at the bay. It's a pretty Silver Bay spot.
Really, really pretty. There's some more questions coming in. A lot of great presentations, really excellent presentation. Everyone really enjoyed it. And someone asked if there will be volunteer opportunities on some level.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think we're starting to, I think like with everything else, right now we're kind of a little bit more of an upswing. Our weather is getting better. We definitely kind of pulled back with volunteers due to COVID. We've had extensive volunteers in the past, but had to put a lot of that on hold due to COVID. But I'm definitely open to any type of trail volunteers, at this point, or even walking, picking up trash or just monitoring the trails. I always welcome that, because with all the trails and the acreage, it's hard to kind of be everywhere, especially if we have, a wind event or a storm. I always like to try and get out, or have staff go out and say, just, are there any downed trees? Are there any hazards? So it's always helpful. You can go on the Ocean County Parks website, and there's a volunteer section, and there's an application that you can fill out, and it'll send it directly to the parks person that you're looking to go to. So I should receive it, and I'll reach out to you, at that point. So
Perfect.
yeah.
Great. One more question. It's how is the project, your project, the Living Shoreline, being funded?
That's a great question. So I want to say I'm the low man on the totem pole on that piece of it. I really kind of look at myself as kind of the outreach and education section. But to my understanding, there's all those stakeholders that I mentioned before, that there are grant opportunities through different agencies that could be involved, or are involved, or know of different grant opportunities that they're going to be applying to, and going through, those routes. So I don't have the specifics, like I said, because that's not quite my expertise. But they're looking to kind of get grants that will do, certain phases of the project. So.
And I'm going to ask you one more, and it was the address to the trailhead again.
Sure.
So Yellow Bank.
Sure. So Yellow Bank, yes. So the park office is 1198 Bandon, Bandon Road in Toms River.
Yeah.
So you can also access it from Cattus Island. It's a little more confusing, but you definitely can. So essentially, if you've been to Cattus Island, it's the next traffic light. You're going to turn on Yellow Bank Road, not on Cattus Island Boulevard. So.
All right. That's great. We do have some email addresses. We'll probably be forwarding some questions over to you, but
Awesome.
Thank you so much. What a great talk.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be able to share this exciting news with everyone. I know we're excited to see how this is going to happen, and how it works, and what great things it can do for the park. So thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Nikki.
Thank you, Nikki. I made it almost all the way through without technical difficulties, but there's always something.
It was a good night.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And
You're
we
welcome.
definitely will be in touch.
You're welcome. Yes, awesome. Great.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Our next program, March.
Mosquitoes, March
Mosquitoes,
15th, 7
March
to 8.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.